Hello and welcome to the Tudor Travel Show. Wherever you're listening to us from in the world, you are most welcome. And particularly if this is your first time tuning into the Tudor Travel Show, it is wonderful to have you here. Now, perhaps one of the first things you might do is grab a pen and paper, because a little later on in the show, I'm going to be talking to you about a couple of key Tudor dates in the diary, dates that you will not want to miss if you can help it, because you really will be able to indulge your Tudor passion to your heart's content. So, as I say, grab a piece of paper, we'll come back to that later. Now, in terms of today's show, as most of you are aware, we often have a theme for the show, and in this month the theme is King Edward VI. In the first part of today's Tudor Travel Show, I'm going to be visiting Penshurst Place in Kent, and we're going to be going on a tour of Penshurst, looking at some of the key aspects of the building's history, but also particularly its Tudor history. And of course, Penshurst was granted to the Sidney family, who have been associated now with Penshurst Place for hundreds of years, by King Edward VI when he gifted Penshurst, nice gift, to Sir William Sidney, who was his chamberlain in 1552. Anyway, we will hear more about that in a moment. In the second part of the podcast, we will be talking to Florence Evans now. Some of you may recognise that name, for Florence spoke to us a few months ago about a very special picture of Elizabeth I, which passed through the gallery of which she is a director, the Weiss Gallery in London, a couple of years ago. And Florence told us all about that painting. And in today's podcast, she's back to tell us about a very interesting painting by a preeminent painter of King Edward VI's court. And then, of course, we have our Tudor Travel Show news desk. Who wouldn't be without that? And today we head back in time to witness the dramatic events that are unfolding around the arrest of Catherine Howard. So, as usual, there's a lot of ground to cover, and I guess we should dive straight on in and go over to Penshurst Place. Now, as I said, earlier in the summer, I visited Penshurst and I met up with Gaye Jee, who is one of the visitor guides at Penshurst. And we took a stroll through Penshurst Place, and I had a chance to ask Gaye all my burning questions about its Tudor history and the beautiful architecture and interiors of the building. Our tour begins in the inner courtyard at Penshurst Place, and I began by asking Gaye to describe the buildings that we could see around us and what they illustrated about the building phases at Penshurst.
So this courtyard's quite good actually, because it does show the different periods of the house. So behind me here you can see a Tudor part made from Tudor brick, which became very popular in Elizabethan times, because a lot of times ships would go over to the continent, particularly over this side of the country, and they'd return with brick in the hold as ballast. And it then became a very popular building material, particularly on the east of England. So this part was built in the Tudor times. And then the King's Tower here was built in 1585, and it was built by Henry Sidney, who inherited Penshurst from his father William Sidney. And he built it to commemorate the gift of Penshurst Place by Edward VI to the Sidney family.
Hence the King's Tower, of course.
Indeed, yes.
So we've got sort of quite a span of years just in this one courtyard.
Yes.
So maybe we should go inside and just explore some of the earliest part.
Absolutely.
Let's go.
Let's go.
inside, and as you said, Gaye, we're in the oldest part of Penshurst Place, which is the medieval hall, the Baron's Hall, and I have to say it's one of my favourite halls. It's quite spectacular, isn't it?
Yes, it is. It's supposed to be the largest remaining hall house in England. The roof is 60 feet to the top. It's about 65 feet long and 30 feet wide. It's built by Sir John de Pulteney, as I think you know, who was a very wealthy merchant. And the roof itself is made out of Spanish chestnut, which wasn't indigenous at the time. And it's thought it came back in the holds of his ships. So when he topped off the roof in 1341, he did it with this, which is supposed to be as strong as oak but lighter.
Right, okay.
Which could explain why it's still there.
Yes.
So you can see these enormous arched braces, and at the end of each of them there is a satirical figure. And we don't know who they are, but they're thought to be workers on the estate. And this one in the middle, we think he could be the very first head gardener, whose name was Curtis, and he's got what remains of a spade. Unfortunately, they lost their feet sometime, we don't know when.
They are amazing characters, and so beautifully dressed in their medieval garb.
Yes, and they all look really, really miserable.
Oh dear. But this is, now in terms of structure, this is a hall house?
A medieval hall house, yes. And it conforms to the pattern of medieval hall houses, which you can think of as a capital H. So this room, which, as I say, is 60-odd feet long, would be the cross part of the H. And then at either end, you've got upstairs chambers known as solars, which wouldn't be connected to each other, but they would be the upper part of the H.
And they would be used by the family, wouldn't they?
That's right, yes. Everybody would live in here. They would literally sleep in here, eat in here, have parties in here. If it was really cold, the animals would be in here as well. But the family would retire to the solars for a bit of peace and quiet.
And just looking around, what the things that sort of catch my eye, this fabulous sort of Minstrels Gallery, which is kind of is it an oak, made of oak?
Yes, and interestingly, this wouldn't have been part of the original 14th century structure. This would have been put in by the Sidney family after they'd been given the house by Edward VI in 1552. And we know that because you can see the family symbols such as the broad arrow or Fion in the middle there. Also the bear and ragged staff, which is the symbol of Warwickshire. And the reason we have that here is that Mary Sidney, Mary Dudley, married Henry Sidney, and it was a very prestigious match. So if you had a badge that you could add to your own badges, then you'd flaunt it.
Absolutely. And it's quite dull now, but I can see flecks of really beautifully coloured paint. So I imagine in its heyday it was really vibrant.
It was probably really brightly coloured. In fact, all the walls could easily have been painted in very bright colours.
So just a couple of other features in here that I think are quite important. You've obviously you've got this wonderful octagonal fireplace, and of course all medieval halls originally had a
central
fireplace.
Fireplaces, yes.
The smoke would escape from the roof. You haven't got the Louvre, but you've still got the fireplace. That's quite unusual, isn't it?
It is unusual, and actually this one is octagonal, which is thought to be unique. We do still have fires in here from time to time, but they burn charcoal.
I see.
Because we don't want smoke going.
We don't want the
soot. No, that's right.
And I know, because obviously I've been here before, I got a sneaky peek, but these tables are amazing, aren't they? Because they're really old, so
they are.
How old are they?
Well, they're almost as old as the hall itself, certainly within 100 years. And there's supposed to be just one more set of tables like them in the country. And these are the actual tables where the servants would have sat. So the more important servants would have sat towards that end, nearest to the dais, and then all the less important to the other end. These lot would definitely be below the salt.
Yeah.
And then, of course, the family and their guests would sit on a table at the dais.
And that's going to lead us nicely into the next room, because obviously that's the high end of the hall.
Indeed, yes.
And we're going to be going up the staircase that would lead up to the solar. But just amazing to think of this hall with the fire lit
full of people, and of course the floor would have been beaten earth and covered in rushes, perhaps with some herbs strewn on. And we always say, you know, they would regularly changed twice a year, whether they needed it or not.
Yes, you do hear them say that.
You do. So incredibly cold, of course, in the winter. If you come here in the winter or in the early spring, our stewards are wrapped up with their thermals on. So people were living in here. This would never have been a big leaping fire. It would have been a small glimmering fire. So if you were really lucky, you'd be lying next to it. But if you weren't, you'd be...
That must have been a position of privilege.
Indeed,
that's all I
yes,
can say.
yes. And of course the kitchens would have been through the archway in the centre here. We have the pantry on the right-hand side. Again, this is the typical medieval hall house layout. The pantry on the right-hand side, the buttery where all the drink was kept on the left-hand side, and then a passageway leading to the kitchens, because the chances were kitchens were going to catch fire at some point, and they didn't want them then to take the whole building with them.
It's really beautifully preserved, those three doorways. That's another feature of this hall I particularly admire, because you get to see that very cleanly, don't you? Although the medieval kitchens were knocked down, I think, in the 19th century, you've still
quite
got
a while ago.
You've still got that layout to get a feel for how the hall would have
That's right, and you do see in other buildings of a similar age that quite often it's all been divided up, or there's been a loggia put in or whatever.
Yeah, good. So, well, I think we should go up to the solar and check it out what's up there. Okay,
all right.
Cool. Now we've come upstairs, so from the high end of the hall, there's this beautiful stone-carved staircase, which is Tudor, I believe. Is that
yes,
right?
It was actually installed by Sir Henry Sidney when he inherited Penshurst Place from his father. So that would be in the late 1500s.
I see, and that leads us up into this another really grand room, which, as you said before, is one of the ends of the H.
Yes, this would have been the end of the original house, one of the ends of the original house.
So in the medieval period, this was it?
This was it. This is where the family would come to get away from what was going on downstairs. And the word solar doesn't come from light or from sunlight, it comes from the French sol, meaning alone. So a lot of the time the ladies would come up here to maybe get away from the shenanigans downstairs, which might be getting quite out of hand. Incidentally, there's a little window further along the wall where they could look out down onto the Baron's Hall and see what their husbands were up to.
That must have been quite entertaining at times,
well, yes, I mean, we can imagine that indeed. This is also where the family would sleep, probably in curtained alcoves.
Yes, because it was all communal living originally in the medieval period. It really wasn't until the Tudor period when the aristocracy started to create smaller and smaller rooms, divided up, more privacy in their living. But in the medieval period, everybody would have been in this.
That's
well, of
right.
the family anyway, the private family.
And of course, because there is a Tudor wing here at Penshurst, which is part of the private apartments, you'd probably see the bedrooms of the period there.
Yes, I see. And this room actually, because it was originally the end room, it had some beautiful windows, didn't it? And we've lost those today because more buildings have been added on.
Yes, and in fact that sort of adds weight to the erroneous belief that solar means light, because it would have been much lighter in here. And the door at the back there now, that would have been a window.
I see.
And then there are windows here and a couple more that way as well. So it definitely would have been a lot lighter at the time.
Well, it's a beautiful grand chamber, quite magnificent for living in.
Yes.
And so, you know, we know that Henry VIII visited here, Elizabeth visited here, so they would have been in these rooms, wouldn't they?
Well, indeed. Well, Henry VIII, of course, owned Penshurst Place for a while, having taken it from the 3rd Duke of Buckingham. So
he was unfortunately minus ahead at this point.
Well, he was, yes. Yes, he overstepped the mark. He invited Henry here for 3 days of banqueting because he thought there was a chance that, as he had quite a bit of royal blood in his veins, that Henry would name him as his successor at a time when he didn't have a male heir. Unfortunately, Henry was not really impressed, and within 2 years he was convicted of treason and had his head removed, and because it was treason it meant that all his lands became forfeit to the crown. So that's how it moved into Henry VIII's possession And then, of course, his son Edward VI owned it, and it was Edward who gave it to the Sidney family.
Okay, we're going to move now from the solar sort of deeper into the house, into a part of the house that was built a little later on.
Yes,
and,
that's right.
Let's go and see, because I think that's got something to do with Elizabeth.
It has, yes.
Yeah. So we've come into another magnificent room. This is the Elizabeth
The
room.
Queen Elizabeth room.
Queen Elizabeth
yes,
room.
Yes.
And so tell us about this room. When was it built, and does it look like it used to look?
Well, not at all, really. It was actually built in around 1430, and originally this room and the next room were all one. And so it was twice as long and probably much higher. Well, it was much higher. So a range of apartments were put in above here.
So it would have been really tall. I mean,
Yes.
almost like Great Hall
Exactly.
size.
And maybe they realised, having built it, they didn't need another one.
And of course, the fashions began to change later, didn't it?
The
You know,
smaller
we were
rooms,
talking
yes.
before. People wanted smaller rooms. They wanted more privacy. So maybe it just suited to put the partition in
Yes,
and
that's right.
add that little bit of
Yes.
extra privacy.
Yes.
But it's called the Queen Elizabeth room for there must be reason, I guess.
Well, indeed, yes. So Queen Elizabeth visited quite often to Penshurst Place. One of her ladies in waiting was Mary Sidney. I've mentioned her to do with the Love Altar. So she would come to visit her, and I think particularly after the smallpox, as I say, Mary nursed her through smallpox, and then didn't really go back to court very much. So the Queen would come here to visit her.
We'll move on from this room and we're going to go through to the Long Gallery, which is really the last part of the Tudor house, isn't it? But it's quite a magnificent room,
Yes,
so we
it
should
is.
go and enjoy
Yes.
the beautiful view in there. Well, we are in the Elizabethan, or almost,
Yes,
it's just an
yes,
Elizabethan,
just
long gallery, and it's a beautiful gallery, isn't
Yes.
it? Can you tell us about it?
Yes, long galleries were built to provide a place to exercise, maybe to dance, to show off your beautiful new dress. They would also have where children would play, and you'd also put paintings of your relatives and your important friends. And of course, the most important friend you could have at the time would be Queen Elizabeth.
And we have her portrait there at the end of the gallery.
And then over the door we have the young King Edward VI, who gave the house to the family.
Do we know why he gifted it?
Yes, we do. Sir William Sidney was his chamberlain, really. He was a man who was looking after the young king very well. He looked out for his interests, and the king wanted to reward him for all the good work he'd done. So in 1552, he made a gift of Penshurst Place to him. His William Sidney's wife, Anne, was also the young king's governess, effectively, and Henry Sidney, although he was a bit older, was a very good friend to the king, and it's said that it's in his arms that Edward VI eventually died.
I see, so they were really closely connected.
Yes, so the estate of Penshurst was given to reward him. Of course, Sir William Sidney was, I think, in his early 70s by then, which in those days was quite
Very old, yes.
And within a couple of years, his son Henry became the next owner of Penshurst.
I see, I see. Just lovely walking here in the gallery today. The sun is out.
Yes.
Finally. There's been a lot of showers today, but the pools of light on the floor just make it really magical and inviting.
It would have been a lot lighter because of the way it's been built than a normal long gallery, which, as I say, would be along the long side of a house.
Wow, it's lovely.
We're going to go downstairs in a minute. The rooms immediately below would never have been staterooms. However, there is one thing down there which I think you'll be interested in.
Okay, well, we need to go and take a look.
To you about Sir Philip Sidney, who was a poet, a courtier and a diplomat and a favourite at the Queen's court. Now, he died in 1585 5 from complications following a leg wound in the Netherlands, and the Queen wanted his body to be brought back to England so he could have a state funeral. She didn't want to pay for it, mind you, so his father-in-law, Sir Francis Walsingham, was offered the opportunity to pay for it and nearly beggared himself in the process. But when the body returned, he had a magnificent funeral. The funeral procession went on and on. And
was this in London?
Yes, it was. And in fact, he was buried in Old St Paul's, which then, of course, burnt down some years later. But this item here is his funeral helm.
Okay.
So he never would have worn this in battle. Obviously, the balance would have been all wrong.
Yes.
But it's surmounted by the family crest, which is a porcupine. And originally, the porcupine would have been painted in the family colours of blue and yellow.
I see.
And the spines would have been gilded, so it would have been absolutely magnificent. Wow. And as I say, it would have been carried in his funeral procession.
Was that carried by somebody? Or
yes,
was it
on a cushion.
Oh, right.
Yes.
I see, yeah.
And they say that Sir Francis Walsingham spent such a lot of money on Sir Philip Sidney's funeral that when he grew a little older, he had a codicil put in his own will that when he died, he was to be buried at night because it was cheaper.
That's a wonderful story. Excellent. So much again, but before we go, obviously people may be wanting to plan a visit here, so what do they need to know about kind of access and opening hours?
We are open every day every day from the beginning of April to the end of October. We're also open weekends during March, but I'd suggest they have a look at our website at penshurstplace.com, which gives full details.
Well, that's perfect. Well, thanks very much, Gaye.
You're very welcome. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
So that was me in conversation with Gaye Jee, visitor guide at Penshurst Place. Thank you to all the staff at Penshurst who invited me in and made me so welcome. I hope you enjoyed that little tour of the property, and if you want to see more of Penshurst Place, then why not head over to YouTube and search for the Tudor Travel Guide channel. Whilst at Penshurst, I also took the opportunity to make a 10-minute video where you'll see a lot more of the exteriors of the building, and I talk in a little bit more detail about the Tudor history of the palace, in particular in relationship to the Boleyns. Excellent. So with that, we are now ready to head over to the TTG News Desk and find out exactly what dramatic news has been breaking in the Tudor month of November.
Welcome to the November O'Clock News with your newsreader, Robert Cole. Here are the Tudor headlines for the month. Rumours of Catherine Howard's infidelity circulate at court. Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn arrive back in England following their triumph at Calais. Jane Seymour's body is buried in St George's Chapel, Windsor. And Lady Jane Grey is tried for treason at the Guildhall in London. Good day. Now for our top story today. Rumours are circulating at court that King Henry VIII of England has left Hampton Court Palace in a storm of controversy that is currently surrounding his wife, Queen Catherine Howard. Unconfirmed reports from Lambeth Palace, official London residence of the Archbishop of Canterbury, suggests that accusations of infidelity have been laid against the young Queen, who was joined in matrimony with His Grace barely 1 year ago. It is believed that the King left Hampton Court several days ago, on the 6th of November, while the Queen has been moved, under armed guard, to Syon House on the north bank of the River Thames, opposite Richmond Park. Here in the studio to tell us more about this delicate situation is our reporter Catherine Simmons. Catherine, there seems to be a great deal of confusion about what exactly is going on in the royal household at the current time. Can you tell us what you know?
Yes, you're right, Robert. It is a delicate situation. There is a huge amount of secrecy around these events. It's quite clear that the palace does not want people to know exactly what is transpiring behind closed doors. However, my source at Lambeth Palace told me that the current crisis began when the Archbishop Cranmer was approached by Lord Chancellor Audley and the Earl of Hertford about the Queen's, how can I say this delicately, light behaviour? These accusations have apparently been levelled at her by someone who once lived alongside the Queen at my Lady of Norfolk's house before she came to court. At present, we are not sure who that lady is, but only that she refused to enter the Queen's household on account of the sordid behaviour she had witnessed in the past.
And what are these accusations exactly?
Well, they are that the Queen has lived most corruptly and sensually while under the guardianship of the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, whose care, of course, the Queen was under until she came to court to serve the lady now known to all as the King's sister, Anne of Cleves. There are some lurid details coming to light about how she, the Queen, hath laid in bed naked with a certain Francis Derham. Of course, he is currently the Queen's gentleman usher, but both have known each other from their younger years.
And the King, how did he come to hear of the scandal?
Archbishop Cranmer was pressed to approach the King and, having questioned the unknown accuser himself, left a note for His Majesty in the King's holy day closet at Hampton Court. My understanding is that initially His Grace dismissed these claims and would hear little of them. After all, it is well known that His Majesty refers to Her Grace as being the very jewel of womanhood. Apparently, the King claimed they were likely vicious lies and, I quote, more forged matter than the truth. Subsequently, the Archbishop was tasked with investigating these claims, and it is my understanding that they have indeed been substantiated. We now know that the King left Hampton Court just a few days thereafter. And as you said at the top of the story, the Queen herself has since been moved to Sion House under house arrest. And
what will happen to her there?
We know that her jewels, perhaps one of the most symbolic trappings of her high estate, have already been seized. Although she has already been interrogated by Archbishop Cranmer, and I believe on one occasion her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, she is likely to face further questioning in the coming weeks. Reports are that the Queen is deeply distressed, hysterical even, but that she has already admitted to transgressions with more than one gentleman. Although I should stress that as far as we are aware at the moment, these transgressions appear to have occurred before she married His Majesty.
So what do you think will happen in the long run? Will she still remain as Queen? Is the King likely to press for divorce?
At this stage, frankly, it is hard to say. After all, the King is not much taken to clemency in situations like this, as we have already seen with the Queen's late cousin, Anne Boleyn. My suspicion is that if indeed these accusations are true, then the King will move against her. The question is, will this be limited to divorce or annulment? Or will this sorry tale lead only to the scaffold and the Queen end up paying for the wayward behaviour of her youth with her life? That, Robert, remains to be seen.
What dramatic events are unfolding here in London? Well, thank you for that, Catherine. That now concludes the November O'Clock news for the month. All that remains for me is to say that the TTG News Desk will return in December, but for now, it's back to the 21st century.
Oh, I always feel so sorry for Catherine Howard. I know in many ways she was the architect of her own downfall, but the poor girl must have been terrified. Anyway, I think it's time to shake that off and listen to a piece of music. And this is one by one of our favourite composers here on the Tudor Travel Show, and that is Thomas Morley. And it's called My Own Sweet Jewel. it's time to move on to the second part of the show. And we're welcoming back Florence Evans of the Weiss Gallery in London. And now some of you will remember Florence. She was talking to us a few months ago about a very special portrait of Elizabeth I. And while I was in the gallery earlier this summer, I just happened to notice a portrait of a very familiar fellow. And that inspired me to invite Florence back onto the show so that she could tell us all about the secrets of this particular portrait, which is one by the studio of William Scrots. And it is a painting of the boy king Edward VI. And now, before I go over and start my conversation with Florence, I wanted to let you know that there is a blog article which does accompany this part of the podcast, where you will be able to not only see the portrait under discussion, but there are some further notes about the portrait and about William Scrots. So I will post a link to the blog in the show notes accompanying this podcast. So I think all that remains for us is to go over and begin our conversation with Florence. So hello Florence, welcome back to the Tudor Travel Show.
Hi Sarah, good to speak to you again.
We have another fascinating painting to talk about.
We do indeed.
And we do. And really, this came about because when I was last in your gallery, I noticed almost sitting over your left shoulder was a portrait of someone rather familiar. And I asked if you would come back on the show and talk to us about that portrait. So today we're going to be talking about a portrait of the young King Edward VI.
That's right, the boy king of England.
Indeed. But so maybe we could start by describing the painting for us.
Right. Well, rather like the Elizabeth I that we chatted about on our last podcast together, this is on a lovely intimate scale. It's a small bust-length portrait of Edward. And it derives from some full-length versions which can be seen in Hampton Court Palace and also at the Louvre in Paris. And it's by William Scrots, from the studio of William Scrots. He was an artist who was appointed as the king's painter by Henry VIII shortly before he died. But the painting in question, I should go back to a description of it. It shows the young Edward with an incredibly pallid face, which really I think evokes his mother, Jane Seymour, and with these wonderfully startling blue eyes and a beautiful doublet of red velvet silk, actually cloth of gold, which we can chat about further in our conversation, wonderfully and richly embroidered with gold thread.
It really is, isn't it? He's got that beautiful flaming red Tudor hair showing in his eyebrows as well. In the hair.
Again, I think he really, in that sense, sort of looks rather like his half-sister Elizabeth.
Yes, because they've both got quite almond-shaped faces, haven't they? Which I think is reminds me of her, certainly. And as you say, there's by the way, for those people listening to this podcast, of course, I will post a picture and a short accompanying blog to go with this podcast, so you can look at the picture as you listen to Florence and I talking. But his garment is really what catches the eye, because it's simply just so rich, isn't it?
It is, and it is quite literally a costly commission. It contains in the painting itself both silver leaf and gold leaf, which would have been an incredibly expensive process. So I should explain, under the red doublet, the artist has laid silver leaf, and this is to give it a wonderful glow and shimmer, to give the effect of cloth of gold. Now, cloth of gold was a specifically royal fabric, which was only worn by kings traditionally, and it was woven red silk with real silver or gold threads. So having the silver under the red pigment in his doublet here gives it a shimmer. It literally shines in the light and catches the light in the most wonderful way, especially, I should say, in the evening with a golden light, candle light. You can imagine how evocative it is. And then again, on top of that, over the gold embroidery, which has been painted with a yellow pigment, is applied gold leaf. So it's an exquisite jewel of a painting, and it really is an extraordinary thing to behold.
So that would actually, I think, as you were referring to, mean that the actual painting itself would cost quite a lot.
Yes, we can assume that this would have been a royal commission, and it would have been painted to be given as a stately gift to a loyal courtier and disseminated really to someone in the young boy king's circle. And it is undoubtedly a royal commission, I would say, although provenance-wise we can only trace it back to the 17th century. I say only, that's still quite a long way, isn't it?
Yes, it is. So, Florence, what I find really intriguing is your description of this use of silver leaf and gold leaf for creating the effect of the fabric. And was that a technique that was widely used at the time?
I would say, Sarah, this is a really interesting question. It was widely used in royal iconography, specifically in Tudor England. And this is because it was a skill set that artists in England developed to present costume in as magnificent a way as possible, because, of course, sitters at the time wanted to display their wealth through a shimmering array of their costume and display of their clothes. And a lot of artists working in England at that time were trained in goldsmith studios. So you would have artists like William Peake at the time, and of course Scrots, our artist here, who had studio assistants who were trained to apply both gold and silver leaf to their paintings. Artists in Tudor England were really craftsmen rather than specific individuals who were known for their own name as being kind of names in their own right. So you have craftsmen working, and in the end, the ultimate painting that was commissioned was a work of great craft rather than the work of an artist who was known as a person per se. I'm coming across perhaps in a rather garbled way, but I hope that kind of conveys to you the sense that this is a painting where craft is the most important element to create the sense of wealth, and where gold and silver comes in so beautifully to present that.
Well, that's very clear, and that's really interesting. I never really thought of it in that way. So if we can think about the painter, you talked about William Scrots, who took over from Holbein, and certainly most people are very aware of Holbein and all those amazing works that he did. I, for one, am certainly less familiar with Mr. Scrots. And so what can you tell us about him?
William Scrots was presumably of Flemish extraction, and he was first recorded in 1537 as court painter to Mary of Hungary, who was regent of the Netherlands. But the intriguing thing is that there are no known works by him from that period today. And in fact, he's almost exclusively known for his British work and his portraits of Edward VI. Now, he must have established a reputation when he was working in the Netherlands, because when he succeeded Holbein as king's painter for Henry VIII in 1545, he had an extraordinarily high salary, which was over £62, which is almost twice as much as Holbein's stipend. So when you think that Holbein was a megastar, really, Scrots was even more successful. And it's extraordinary when you think of it in that context, because today he's not really known in the same way that Holbein is. But he must have been incredibly respected as an artist when he came over to England and started painting in the court of Henry VIII.
Can I ask your professional opinion about a comparison between Holbein and Scrots? How would you rate them?
Well, it's a difficult question, Sarah, because I have to say Holbein is one of my favourite artists. I think in terms of realism and in terms of a modern eye, Holbein is and was absolutely extraordinary. Whereas when we look at Scrots and the work of Scrots, there is a naivety to the way in which he renders a face, which perhaps doesn't quite sing in the same way that Holbein does for us today.
Yeah.
But he was undoubtedly accomplished, and what he really did achieve was an extraordinary portrayal of costume, as we've discussed. And I mean, I think also there's a wonderful flavour to that naivety that is so typical of Tudor England, that it has a place in royal iconography in British history and within art history today. I think that, you know, he definitely deserves recognition as an artist.
Well, that's fascinating about Holbein, because Holbein is absolutely one of my favourite painters, because sometimes you just feel like you're looking at a photograph of somebody. It's as if they were alive now, whereas this painting is obviously a painting of somebody, and I feel like I'm looking at somebody who's, you know, from 500 years ago. But it's really fascinating to hear your sort of professional opinion about the merits of both of these artists.
Thank you.
But the painting, the date of the painting, has it been tested? I mean, how do we know? I can't remember, actually. Did we mention the date that we thought this painting had been painted, and how do we know that?
Well, there are a number of elements that come into play here. So, firstly, I should say that when we bought this painting from Bonhams in 2017, it was catalogued as being by a follower of William Scrots. But when we bought it, we were pretty sure from looking at the paint surface that it was certainly contemporary, and we the painting underwent tree ring analysis by Ian Tyers, who is a dendrochronologist. That's quite a mouthful, I realise. So he was able to test and count the number of tree rings, which gave a date for the panel before 1542. Now, I should say that panels often took over a decade to prepare until they were ready to be painted on. So this date fits really beautifully with the date for when we believe it was painted. Now, obviously, as I mentioned at the beginning of our chat, this relates to some full lengths which were painted by Scrots around the time that the young prince, nearly king, sat for the artist in sort of 1545. And by 1547, obviously, with the death of Henry VIII, many more versions were knocked out from Scrots' studio to really celebrate his reign as king. And I think that this probably came on the back of that flurry of commissions from the royal court at that time. So we can confidently say it would have been painted certainly by 1550. And yes, I mean, I think that it's fairly it's as certain as it can be with this sort of painting.
But definitely during the young king's lifetime. So
absolutely, without a doubt.
Now that brings me on.
The wonder of scientific analysis,
isn't it?
Which is helpful today. Yeah.
It's amazing. But this brings me on to my favourite bit, which is always about the provenance and the story and how these paintings, you know, what families they move through and how they get to be where they are. So what do we know of the life story of this painting?
Yes, well, obviously, as I say, we bought it at Bonhams, and it was sold by a family who had had it since the or certainly the sort of last quarter of the 17th century. It was recorded in the collection of Thomas Burnet, 2nd Laird of Kemnay in Aberdeenshire. And it descended until 2017 in that family when they sold it through Bonhams to us. Now, it's interesting that it has that Scottish angle because, of course, we have such a strong link with Scotland, and the royal family had such a strong link with Scotland at that time. So I think it could well have been given to a courtier with those Scottish connections, possibly even to the family of Thomas Burnet. It's just that he is the first person to have actually recorded it within his collection in a document. So, yes, and it's got a whole Scottish angle, I would say, in answer to your question.
Well, so it's lived a long time in Scotland before returning south of the border.
Exactly.
Well, that's been, as ever, fascinating to talk to you, and a fabulous insight from a true professional in terms of...
Oh, thank you, sir. Thank you. It's been a pleasure, as always.
Oh, thanks ever so much. Well, I've learnt more today, quite a bit more actually, about Tudor paintings and about William Scrots in particular, so thank you. And I look forward to welcoming you on the show again when we find another fascinating portrait to talk about.
Well, I look forward to it as well. I'm sure we'll find plenty of things to talk about. I mean, we're always getting new and exciting paintings to research, and you will be the first to know when we get something Tudor.
Excellent.
That is for sure.
Excellent. Thanks so much then, Florence. So once again, that brings us towards the end of November's show. But I did promise you at the top of the programme that I had a few Tudor dates for the calendar for next year. So if you have your pen and paper to hand, then let me tell you about 3 specific dates that are forthcoming in 2020. Now, the first of these is in June, and it's a real heads up. You may remember earlier this year, I spoke to Maya from Dig Ventures. They were undertaking their first year's dig at Sudeley Castle. Castle. Well, things went so well, as you know, that Dig Ventures are returning for another week of digging in June, and this will be followed on the 13th and 14th of June by their annual archaeology festival. And this year it's dedicated to the anniversary of the Field of Cloth of Gold, which of course has its 500th anniversary in 2020. And there's going to be a whole host of fabulous speakers and events. And maybe yours truly may be there too. So more details will be coming, and I understand from Maya that tickets will be available from around the 1st of December. So look out for that, and certainly I will be letting people know more details about these events through my newsletter, social media and forthcoming podcasts. And the second date I have for your diary is next year's first Chuda Meetup, in fact a Midsummer Chuda Meetup. So some of you may be aware that I started a Chuda Meetup last year, and after 2 very successful events was definitely a will for us to carry on in 2020. And it's a very special one because we have been invited to Norfolk, to the house of one of the Chuda Meetup attendees, Brigitte Webster, who also runs the Tudor and 17th century experience from their beautiful Tudor home in Norfolk. Now, Brigitte is a specialist in historic cooking, and she recreates wonderful Tudor experiences for people who want to go and spend time with her. And we're very lucky to have an invitation to go and visit an absolutely beautiful Tudor house that she lives in, and to enjoy a tour of the house and some Tudor treats. Again, the date for this is going to be Saturday, the 27th of June, a wonderful midsummer Tudor treat. And more details will be following on that shortly. And if you're interested, you will be able to book to come on the event. Now, the final date I have for your diary is a very special date in September 2020. Now, some of you will have taken part in the recent 1535 virtual mini progress that I co-hosted with my co-author of the In the Footsteps books, Natalie Gruniger. And there was a tremendous amount of interest in that. And as a result, I am currently putting together a real life 1535 mini progress with British history tours. And we are going to be taking a group of Tudor enthusiasts from Sudeley Castle and wending our way through places like Tewkesbury and Gloucester and Berkeley to Thornbury. And we are hoping that this is all going to happen in early September next year. So again, all the dates are being finalised for that, and there will be more information coming your way soon. And if you're interested in any of these, the very best way to keep in touch and make sure that you get the details of all these events as they are released is to make sure you're signed up and subscribed to the Tudor Travel Guide newsletter. And you can do that via the Tudor Travel Guide blog and the homepage on www.thetudortravelguide.com. So I look forward to sharing a lot more detail with you in the coming weeks. So that is the end of the programme, and as ever, I wanted to finish the programme by thanking the patrons of this show. And this month we have a new patron, and I would just like to welcome Mark Waddell to the patrons group. I am incredibly grateful to all of you for your continued support of the Tudor Travel Show. Next week, I head off to Hever Castle for a very special podcast recording. We are going to be recording a Tudor Christmas at Hever, both for the podcast, and there will be a YouTube video coming your way. So I can't wait, because I've never visited Hever before at Christmas, and I've seen the pictures and it looks amazing. So I'm really excited to be back here next month in December for our Christmas special. Until then, my time travelling friends, have a wonderful month, and I look forward to being together with you again very soon.